Sometimes the smallest detail is the difference between losing everything and saving a life. No one in the room noticed the waitress at first. They were too focused on the boy lying quietly in the hospital bed, too focused on the monitors, the charts, the whispered conversations between doctors who wore expressions that had already delivered their verdict. 8-year-old Lucas Whitmore stared at the ceiling lights above him, his small hands resting still against the white sheets, while the most respected neurologist in New York City stood near the foot of his bed speaking in voices carefully lowered so the father wouldn't hear every word. But Daniel Whitmore heard enough. He heard the pauses. He heard the uncertainty. And most of all, he heard the sentence no parent ever wants to hear. We've exhausted the available options. Daniel Whitmore had built a fortune large enough to buy entire hospitals, fund research labs, and bring the world's top specialists to one room in less than 24 hours. Yet none of that power seemed to matter now. He stood beside the window of the private recovery suite, looking down at the Manhattan skyline 40 floors below, his hands clenched inside the pockets of a perfectly tailored navy suit that suddenly felt far too heavy for the moment. Lucas had collapsed 3 days earlier during a routine afternoon at school. Since then, every test imaginable had been performed. MRIs, blood panels, neurological scans, consultations with experts from Boston, Chicago, even a specialist flown in overnight from Switzerland. Each one studied the results carefully. Each one shook their head in the same quiet way. Across the room, the lead neurologist closed Lucas's chart and spoke gently. "Mr. Whitmore, we're continuing supportive care, but right now the condition isn't responding to treatment the way we hoped." Daniel nodded once, the controlled motion of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering composure in boardrooms and negotiations. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was his son. Lucas shifted slightly in the bed, his eyes moving toward the door where a small hospital café tray had just been delivered. The young waitress who carried it paused for a moment before setting the tray down carefully on the side table. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She wore the standard café uniform, simple black slacks, a white shirt, and a dark apron tied neatly at her waist. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged anywhere near a medical conversation between some of the country's most respected doctors. She should have left immediately after delivering the tray. Instead, Emily's eyes lingered on Lucas, not in the sympathetic way most visitors had looked at him during the past few days. Her gaze was different, focused, observing. The boy's fingers moved slightly against the sheet, a tiny motion most people in the room missed entirely. Emily didn't miss it. She watched the movement again. Then she noticed something else. The way Lucas's breathing changed when he tried to shift his hand. The subtle tension in his wrist. Daniel Whitmore didn't notice the waitress watching his son. He was still staring at the doctors, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something different than what he'd already heard. Emily hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stepped a little closer to the bed and spoke quietly, her voice calm but clear enough that everyone in the room heard it. "You might want to stop treating this like a neurological shutdown," she said. The room went completely silent. One of the doctors slowly turned toward her, confusion written across his face. Daniel Whitmore looked up for the first time and finally noticed the waitress standing beside his son's hospital bed. Emily met his gaze without hesitation and added softly, "Because I'm pretty sure that's not what's happening to your boy." The silence that followed her words was immediate and heavy, the kind of silence that appears when something unexpected enters a room filled with certainty. One of the neurologists slowly adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the young woman standing beside the hospital bed. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me," he said carefully, his tone polite but firm. "This is a restricted medical consultation." Emily Carter did not step back. She did not raise her voice either. She simply looked down at Lucas Whitmore again, watching the small movements in his fingers that had appeared only seconds earlier. The boy's hand twitched slightly against the cotton sheet, almost like a signal his body was trying to send, but no one had noticed. "You saw that, right?" she asked quietly. None of the doctors answered immediately. Daniel Whitmore turned his head sharply toward the bed. For 3 days he had watched every monitor, every machine, every expression on the doctors' faces. But now he followed the waitress's gaze to his son's hand. Lucas's fingers moved again, just a little, subtle enough that anyone looking for something dramatic might miss it completely. One of the specialists stepped forward and checked the chart again, clearly irritated by the interruption. Reflex activity, he said calmly. It is not uncommon in cases like this. Emily shook her head slightly. That is not a reflex. Her voice remained steady, calm, observational. She pointed gently toward Lucas's wrist. Reflex responses are random. That movement is not random. It happens when he tries to shift his weight. Several of the doctors exchanged skeptical glances. Daniel Whitmore narrowed his eyes at her, studying the waitress more carefully now. She looked young, mid-20s perhaps. Honey-colored hair, tied back simply. No jewelry except a thin silver bracelet. Nothing about her appearance suggested medical authority. Yet she was standing in a room filled with experts and speaking as if she had already studied the situation longer than any of them. You work in the hospital café, Daniel said slowly, his voice controlled but sharp with exhaustion and disbelief. Correct. Emily nodded once. Yes, sir. Then explain to me why a café waitress is giving medical observations to a room full of neurologists. Emily did not appear offended. She simply glanced once more at Lucas and then back at Daniel. Because everyone in this room is looking at the machines, she said quietly, and nobody is watching the patient. The statement hung in the air like a challenge no one expected to hear. One of the younger doctors crossed his arms. Miss, we have been monitoring the patient continuously for 72 hours. Emily nodded. I know. She gestured toward the observation window on the far wall that overlooked the hallway cafe. I have been working 12-hour shifts here all week. I see him every time they wheel him past the window for tests. I noticed something yesterday. Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. What did you notice? Emily hesitated just long enough for the room to grow completely still again. Then she spoke slowly. Your son's condition changes when he tries to move his hand. His breathing pattern shifts first. Then the tension appears in the wrist. It looks neurological, but the pattern is wrong. One of the neurologists frowned. Wrong how? Emily looked at Lucas again and said something that made several doctors stiffen in surprise. Because it does not start in the brain. She lifted her eyes back to Daniel Whitmore. It starts in the nerve compression near the shoulder. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nerve compression near the shoulder. For a moment no one spoke. Then the senior neurologist let out a short breath, the kind professionals release when they believe they are correcting a misunderstanding. That is extremely unlikely, he said. The scans show widespread neurological disruption. Emily did not argue. She simply looked back at Lucas again. The boy's chest rose slowly beneath the hospital blanket. His eyes moved slightly toward the ceiling lights, then toward the sound of voices around him. Emily watched the movement carefully, the way someone watches a puzzle that is almost solved, but not quite. He is trying to move, she said quietly. One of the doctors stepped closer to the bed and lifted Lucas's chart again. The patient cannot initiate voluntary movement. That has already been confirmed. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying Lucas's right arm. The small tremor appeared again, this time just for a second. Not dramatic, not obvious, but there. He can initiate it, she said softly. The signal just cannot finish the trip. Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. It was not hope exactly. Hope had been carefully removed from the room over the past 3 days by careful explanations and cautious medical language. But what he felt now was something else. Curiosity. A tiny crack in the certainty that had surrounded the diagnosis. Explain that, he said. Emily looked toward him and spoke slowly so everyone in the room could hear. If the brain could not send signals at all, there would be no attempt to move. No tension in the wrist. No change in breathing when he tries. One of the younger specialists frowned. You are assuming the breathing pattern is connected. Emily nodded once. It is. She pointed gently toward Lucas's shoulder beneath the blanket. The nerves that control the arm pass through here before they reach the hand. If something is compressing that pathway, the brain still sends the signal. It just gets blocked before it arrives. Several doctors exchanged looks again. This time the expressions were less dismissive and more thoughtful. The senior neurologist folded his arms. You are describing a brachial nerve obstruction, he said. We already evaluated for that. Emily shook her head slightly. You evaluated for trauma or structural damage, she replied. But compression can also come from positioning, muscle tension, even swelling from stress on the joint. The room grew quiet again. Daniel Whitmore looked from the doctors to the waitress and back again. The idea sounded simple. Too simple, perhaps. Yet none of the specialists were immediately dismissing it now. They were thinking. One of them moved closer to Lucas and gently adjusted the blanket to examine the shoulder area. Emily watched carefully, then spoke again, her voice still calm. When he tries to move his fingers, his shoulder tightens first. That is where the signal stops. Lucas's fingers twitched again, as if proving the point. Daniel took one slow step closer to the bed. "If you are right," he said carefully, "what would fix it?" Emily hesitated only a moment. "First, we would have to confirm it." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "And how would you do that?" Emily looked at Lucas, then at the doctors, then back at Daniel Whitmore. "With 30 seconds," she said quietly, "in a different position for his arm." No one moved at first. The room was filled with people who had spent decades studying medicine, people who had built reputations on certainty and evidence. And yet the quiet waitress standing beside the hospital bed had just introduced a possibility none of them had considered. 30 seconds. That was all she had asked for. One of the neurologists looked at Daniel Whitmore as if waiting for him to end the conversation. Another doctor glanced down at Lucas, watching the boy's still arm resting against the white hospital sheet. The machines beside the bed continued their steady rhythm, soft electronic beeps marking each heartbeat and breath. Daniel Whitmore stood very still near the foot of the bed. For 72 hours he had listened to experts explain why nothing more could be done. For 72 hours he had watched his son lie there without answers. Now a cafe waitress had walked into the room and pointed at something the machines had not noticed. Daniel slowly exhaled and looked toward the senior neurologist. "If she is wrong," he said carefully, "what happens?" The doctor answered immediately. "Nothing changes." Daniel nodded once. Then he turned toward Emily Carter. "And if you are right?" Emily looked at Lucas again before answering. "Then he might be able to move his hand." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the room grow quiet again. The neurologist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but after a moment, he stepped closer to the bed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Emily moved carefully toward Lucas's right side. She did not touch the boy yet. She simply observed his shoulder position beneath the blanket. "His arm has been lying in the same position for hours," she explained softly. "If the nerve is compressed here, even a small adjustment could relieve the pressure long enough for the signal to pass." One of the younger doctors frowned. "That would already have been noticed during examination." Emily nodded politely. "It might not show if the arm is always placed back in the same position." Daniel Whitmore watched her closely now, not as a waitress, not as an interruption, as someone who might possibly see what others had missed. "Show them," he said quietly. The neurologist raised a hand. "We should be cautious. We do not want to cause discomfort or further complications." Emily's expression remained calm. "I am not suggesting force," she replied gently, "only repositioning the shoulder slightly and supporting the elbow so the nerve pathway is not compressed." The doctor considered this for a moment. It was not a dangerous suggestion. It was not a dramatic intervention. It was simply a change in positioning. Slowly, the neurologist nodded once. "All right." Carefully, Emily stepped closer to the bed. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the way someone handles something fragile. She slid one hand beneath Lucas's elbow and another beneath the shoulder area through the blanket, adjusting the arm only a few inches. The change was small, barely noticeable to anyone watching from across the room. But Emily's eyes stayed fixed on Lucas's hand. The entire room waited. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. Then Lucas's fingers twitched again. This time the movement was clearer. Daniel Whitmore felt his breath catch as the boy's hand shifted slightly against the sheet. Not randomly, not like a reflex, but as if the signal had finally reached its destination. One of the doctors blinked in surprise. Another leaned closer to the bed. Emily said nothing. She simply stepped back half a step and watched the boy's hand as Lucas's. Fingers slowly curled just a little more. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. Lucas's fingers moved again, slowly curling toward his palm as if a message had finally reached its destination after being lost somewhere along the way. The senior neurologist leaned forward immediately, his eyes fixed on the boy's hand, as if he were watching something impossible happen right in front of him. "Hold on," he said quietly. Another doctor stepped closer to the bed, carefully observing Lucas's wrist and forearm. The movement was small, but it was unmistakable. This time it was not random. It was controlled. Daniel Whitmore felt the world around him narrow to a single point. His son's hand. That was all he could see. For 3 days, Lucas had not been able to respond to commands, not even the smallest movement when doctors asked him to try. Now his fingers had moved twice within seconds. Daniel took a slow step forward until he stood beside the bed. "Lucas," he said softly. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of a father who had been waiting for even the smallest sign. "Son, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes shifted slightly toward the sound of his father's voice. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden recovery, but it was something. Emily Carter remained a quiet presence near the side of the bed. She did not speak. She simply watched the boy's shoulder and arm carefully, making sure the new position remained supported. The neurologist gently lifted Lucas's wrist a fraction of an inch and spoke in a professional tone that was suddenly filled with new attention. "Lucas, if you can hear me, try to move your fingers again." For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the boy's index finger twitched once more. A sharp inhale passed through the group of doctors. One of them quickly checked the monitoring equipment as if expecting the machines to explain what had just happened. But the monitors had not changed. The explanation was standing quietly beside the bed. The neurologist slowly straightened and looked at Emily. His expression had changed. The certainty from earlier was gone, replaced by something far rarer in a room like this. Respect mixed with confusion. "That movement should not be possible under the current diagnosis," he said carefully. Emily nodded slightly. "That is because the diagnosis is incomplete," she replied. Another doctor stepped closer and carefully examined Lucas's shoulder area, feeling along the muscle line where Emily had indicated earlier. His brow tightened as he noticed the tension there. "There is pressure along the nerve pathway," he said slowly. "It is subtle, but it is definitely present." The senior neurologist looked toward Daniel Whitmore. "We may need to run an additional scan focused on the brachial nerve region." Daniel did not answer immediately. He was still watching Lucas's hand resting against the white sheet, his son's fingers now slightly curled as if the effort had tired them. After a moment, Daniel turned toward Emily Carter. The young waitress stood quietly with her hands folded in front of her apron, as if she had simply done her job and expected nothing more. Daniel studied her face carefully. "You noticed this from the hallway café," he said slowly. Emily nodded. "I noticed the pattern," she replied. The movement always tried to start in the fingers, but the shoulder locked first. One of the doctors shook his head softly, still processing what had just happened. That observation would require training most people do not have. Emily's expression remained calm. She glanced once more at Lucas, making sure the boy's arm stayed supported. Then she said something that made the entire room fall silent again. "I used to study neurology before I started serving coffee." The room remained silent after Emily's quiet admission. "I used to study neurology before I started serving coffee." The words seemed to settle slowly over the group of doctors like dust after a sudden movement. One of the specialists looked at her more carefully now, no longer seeing only the café uniform or the simple apron tied neatly at her waist. "Where did you study?" he asked. Emily hesitated for a brief moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer seemed to belong to a different life. "Stanford," she said calmly. Several of the doctors exchanged surprised looks. The senior neurologist lowered Lucas's chart slightly as he studied her face again, as if trying to place something that had suddenly shifted in his understanding of the situation. "Stanford University School of Medicine?" he asked. Emily nodded once. "Neurology program." Daniel Whitmore watched the exchange without speaking. Only minutes earlier, he had questioned why a waitress was speaking inside a room full of medical experts. Now those same experts were looking at her with new attention. One of the younger doctors shook his head slowly. "You do not walk away from a program like that to work in a hospital cafe," he said. Emily's eyes moved back to Lucas for a moment before she answered. "Sometimes life changes plans." Her voice was soft but steady. She did not offer more explanation, and for a few seconds no one asked. The senior neurologist cleared his throat and returned his attention to the patient. Regardless of background, the observation was correct, he said carefully. The nerve compression theory deserves immediate evaluation. Another doctor was already preparing equipment for a targeted scan of Lucas's shoulder and upper arm. The mood inside the room had changed completely. The earlier certainty had been replaced with focused urgency. Daniel Whitmore stepped closer to the bed again. watching Lucas's hand where the fingers now rested in a slightly curled position as if the boy had finally completed a message his body had been trying to send for days. "Lucas," Daniel said quietly, "try moving your hand again for me." The boy's eyelids shifted slightly. His breathing remained steady. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the smallest movement returned, the tip of his index finger lifting a fraction of an inch before settling back against the sheet. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. It was not a full recovery. It was not a miracle, but it was movement. And movement meant possibility. Across the room, one of the technicians finished adjusting the portable scanner and nodded toward the neurologist. "We are ready." The doctors carefully examined Lucas's shoulder region with the imaging device, studying the nerve pathway Emily had described earlier. The monitor displayed the internal structure in quiet shades of gray and white. The senior neurologist leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing as he followed the nerve line across the image. "There," he said suddenly. The room leaned forward as one. A slight narrowing appeared along the pathway near the shoulder joint. Not severe enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to interrupt signals traveling to the arm. Exactly where Emily had pointed. One of the doctors let out a slow breath. "Compression," he confirmed. Daniel Whitmore turned slowly toward Emily Carter. The young woman stood quietly beside the bed, her attention still focused on Lucas rather than the screen or the doctors around it. Daniel studied her for several seconds before speaking. "You saw this before anyone else did," he said. Emily shook her head gently. "I noticed the pattern," she replied. Daniel looked back at his son's hand, and then again at the woman who had been serving coffee in the hallway only an hour earlier. For the first time since Lucas had entered the hospital, Daniel Whitmore felt something return that he had almost lost completely. Hope. The discovery changed the energy inside the room immediately. What had started as quiet resignation was now replaced by focused determination as the doctors studied the scan more carefully. The compression along the nerve pathway was subtle but undeniable. It explained the interrupted signals, the failed movements, and the strange pattern Emily Carter had noticed from the hallway cafe window. The senior neurologist straightened slowly and looked toward the other specialists. "If the nerve pathway is being compressed near the shoulder joint, relieving that pressure could restore the signal completely," he said. One of the doctors nodded while examining the image again. It would explain why the brain scan showed activity while the arm remained unresponsive. Daniel Whitmore listened to the discussion without interrupting. For days he had heard complicated medical explanations that ended with uncertainty. This was the first explanation that sounded clear, logical, fixable. He looked at Lucas again. The boy's breathing remained steady, his small hand resting on the sheet where the fingers had already shown signs of life. Daniel turned slowly toward Emily. "If the pressure is relieved," he asked carefully, "will he regain movement?" Emily did not answer immediately. She studied Lucas's shoulder position again, thinking through the problem the same way she had been doing silently for days while watching through the cafe window. "The signal is already there," she said softly. "That is why the fingers moved when the arm shifted. The nerve is not damaged. It is being blocked." One of the younger doctors nodded in agreement. "Which means if we reduce the compression, the pathway could function normally again." The neurologist turned to the team beside him. "We need to stabilize the shoulder alignment and reduce the tension in the surrounding muscles. That will allow the nerve to decompress." Equipment was quickly brought forward while the doctors prepared a supportive brace designed to hold the shoulder in a corrected position. The process was careful and controlled. Lucas remained calm as the medical team adjusted the support around his upper arm and shoulder, making sure the alignment stayed exactly where the nerve pathway could remain clear. Emily watched quietly from the side, her attention fixed on the boy's arm. Daniel stood beside her now, no longer seeing her as an outsider in the room, but as someone who had brought them to this moment. After several minutes, the brace was secured. The neurologist stepped back and looked toward Lucas again. "All right," he said gently. "Let us try again." Daniel leaned closer to the bed. "Lucas," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tension inside him. "Can you move your hand for me again?" For several seconds the room remained completely still. Every person in the room watched the boy's hand resting against the sheet. Then slowly, carefully, Lucas's fingers began to move. Not just a twitch this time. His hand lifted slightly from the bed, the fingers curling and straightening as if testing the signal that had finally reached them. A stunned silence filled the room. One of the doctors lowered his head slightly in disbelief. The neurologist smiled for the first time since entering the room. Daniel Whitmore felt something inside him break loose as he watched his son move his hand freely for the first time in days. Across the bed, Emily Carter remained quiet, her eyes still focused on Lucas's shoulder to make sure the alignment remained stable. Daniel looked at her again, realizing that the woman who had been serving coffee in the hallway had just changed the entire outcome of the room. Lucas's hand remained lifted above the white hospital sheet for a few seconds, his fingers slowly curling and uncurling as if he was rediscovering something his body had almost forgotten how to do. The room stayed silent, not out of confusion this time, but out of quiet amazement. One of the younger doctors stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the boy's hand. "Lucas," he said gently, "can you squeeze my finger?" He placed his hand carefully into the boy's palm. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then Lucas's fingers closed slowly around the doctor's hand. Not strongly, not perfectly, but with intention. The doctor looked up immediately. "He is responding." The words carried a kind of relief that spread through the room, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the bed, watching his son as if he were witnessing something fragile and precious. Lucas's eyes shifted again, this time focusing more clearly on the voices around him. His fingers loosened slightly before curling again, as if testing the movement again and again. Across the room, the senior neurologist studied the monitor and then Lucas's shoulder brace, making sure the nerve pathway remained clear. "The compression was interfering with signal transmission," he said thoughtfully. "With the pressure relieved, the brain can communicate with the arm again." Another doctor nodded while reviewing the scan images still glowing on the screen. The nerve pathway was never damaged. It was simply blocked. Daniel slowly exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to release after days of uncertainty. He turned toward Emily Carter. The young woman stood quietly near the bed, her hands resting lightly at her sides. She did not look surprised by what had happened. She looked relieved. Daniel studied her face carefully. "You saw this before anyone else," he said softly. Emily shook her head gently. "I noticed something did not match the diagnosis," she replied. Daniel looked back at Lucas's hand as the boy moved his fingers again, the motion becoming more confident with each attempt. The neurologist stepped forward once more and addressed the room. "With the nerve pressure relieved, we expect the arm function to return gradually over the next several hours. Physical therapy will help restore strength, but the signal pathway appears intact." The statement filled the room with quiet satisfaction. The crisis that had seemed unsolvable only hours earlier now had a clear explanation and a clear path forward. One of the doctors turned toward Emily with curiosity still in his voice. "You said you studied neurology at Stanford," he said. "Why leave a program like that?" Emily looked toward Lucas again before answering. The boy was still moving his fingers slowly, the motion becoming smoother each time. "My younger brother developed a similar nerve condition when we were teenagers," she said quietly. "The diagnosis was delayed. By the time doctors found the real cause, the damage was permanent." The room listened in silence. Emily continued softly. "I learned to watch for patterns because sometimes the body tells the truth before the tests do." Daniel Whitmore looked at her with a new understanding. The woman standing beside his son had not only noticed what others had missed, she had recognized it from experience. Lucas moved his hand again, lifting it slightly higher this time. Daniel's eyes followed the motion, and for the first time since the emergency began, he allowed himself to believe his son would be all right. Lucas's hand continued to move slowly against the white hospital sheet, each small motion stronger than the one before. The fingers opened and closed with growing confidence, as if the signal traveling from his brain had finally found a clear road after being blocked for days. The doctors remained nearby, monitoring the equipment and reviewing the new scans, but the tension that had filled the room earlier had faded into quiet relief. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the bed, watching his son with an expression that was no longer controlled or distant. For the first time since Lucas had been admitted to the hospital, the powerful businessman looked simply like a father who had been given back something he feared he had lost. Lucas blinked slowly and turned his head slightly toward Daniel's voice. "Dad." The word was soft and a little tired, but it was unmistakable. Daniel leaned forward immediately. "I am right here, son." Lucas lifted his hand again, studying it with the curious expression of someone rediscovering something familiar. My arm feels funny, he said quietly. One of the neurologists stepped closer and smiled reassuringly. That is normal, he explained gently. The nerve pathway was under pressure for a while. Your arm is just remembering how to move again. Lucas nodded slightly and tried curling his fingers once more. This time the movement was smoother. The doctors exchanged satisfied looks while the senior neurologist made a note on the chart. We will continue to monitor him tonight, he said. With the nerve compression relieved, we expect a full recovery. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the words settle. Full recovery. 2 words that had seemed impossible earlier that day. When he opened his eyes again, he looked across the room toward Emily Carter. The young woman had stepped back quietly while the doctors worked, her presence almost unnoticed now that the crisis had passed. She stood near the doorway with the same calm posture she had carried since entering the room. Daniel walked slowly toward her. The doctors continued speaking behind him, but his attention was fixed on the woman who had changed everything with a single observation. You saved my son, he said quietly. Emily shook her head gently. I noticed something, she replied. The doctors did the rest. Daniel studied her for a moment. Most people would have stayed silent in a room like that. Emily glanced back at Lucas, who was still testing the movement of his fingers with quiet fascination. When you have seen what happens when a signal is ignored, she said softly, you learn not to stay silent. Daniel nodded slowly. He understood what she meant now. The pattern she had recognized was not just medical knowledge. It was something learned through experience, through watching closely when others might overlook the smallest details. Daniel looked toward Lucas again, seeing his son lift his hand one more time, stronger now than before. Then he turned back to Emily Carter. You should not be serving coffee in a hospital cafe, he said. Emily gave a small, thoughtful smile. Sometimes people end up where life places them, she answered. Daniel Whitmore considered her words carefully. Then he said something simple, spoken not with authority but with respect. Sometimes, he replied quietly, the person everyone overlooks is the one who sees the truth first. And across the room, Lucas Whitmore lifted his hand again, proving that the smallest observation can sometimes change everything.